Of course, we know that Ibn Khaldun was a teacher in various forms, not a traditional teacher because he had a bit of contempt for teachers. His theories on education and the art of education itself is actually very interesting. He has very critical perspectives in regards to teachers, especially salaried teachers who he considered to be toothless and effectively only in it for the money, which deprives them of actually the passion and the sincerity necessary to really teach in the real sense of teaching. Ibn Khaldun actually, his own education was very different because he was educated at the home by his father, and later on through scholars, one-to-one education. He's never actually gone to a madrasa or a school in that specific sense. He had really very intimate and direct access to teachers throughout his life. So his outlook is very different actually. He looks at education and books, especially text-based education, as being almost a barrier to learning.
Yes, he does, yes.
And he says there are too many books,
Yes, when I came across that idea that with regards to books or written learning, that, yeah, as you said, is a barrier. And I honestly don't know what to think about that.
Well, he makes it very clear. He makes it very clear. He says, for example, in the Maliki school of thought, if he were to read every book written, it would take more than a lifetime just to read the books, right?
True.
Not talking about thinking about the book, digesting, just to read the books.
It's again what we said in other episodes. I mean, don't forget that, again, we're talking about a man, a human being, who has some certain, is opinionated and has an idea about certain things. We don't have to agree with him just because he has been such a big personality and because we agree in many ways.
Oh, but I agree with him on this one. I agree.
Because
he doesn't just criticize text-based learning and teachers who are paid to teach. He gives the alternative to what he thinks is the best option of learning, which is a teacher who's engaged and also auditory, like listening and dictation.
That's not only
and
what we're
direct.
saying. That's true. What you're saying now, that's what you're saying. That's right, and I agree with what you're saying. But that's not necessarily what he is saying. He is actually he does consider books as being a problem.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree with him.
Well, how can you look? I mean, books are there.
I agree with him in the sense, and I believe you agree with him. You also will agree with him.
You would want me to.
Because the current system we have and we are conditioned to accept is that if it's not written, it is not science.
This video is sponsored by the Muqaddima program. For nearly 7 centuries, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddima has been read and studied by scholars and students of history, sociology, politics and economics as the single most authoritative and astounding work of classical scholarship in the field of history. Embark on an enlightening educational venture led by Muslim scholars and teachers delving into Islamic history, sociology, economics and beyond. Engage with cutting-edge learning cues and multimedia components, allowing for a deeper understanding of the topics. Distinguish between the lies and the truths of the narratives told, between reliable and unreliable sources. Equip yourself with the skills to conduct deep research and build confidence to combat Islamophobia. Come and strengthen your Muslim identity today. Grab the course in the video description.
If it's not written, it's not veritable.
Oral tradition.
If it's not written,
right.
it's not something to be taken seriously.
But I think that's another talk here. I mean,
well, not necessarily, Dr. Stef, because he says that you have somebody who learns from a living institution, the teacher. And the book is an aid to learning, not the actual focus of learning. Today we have the book as the focus.
People can forget that nowadays we have the reference system, which is not nowadays, but it comes from Muslims again. The reference system is there for a reason.
Well, the reference in those days, sorry to cut you in, was a human being. The isnad was more reliable than the reference you have in the book today, because that could be fraudulent.
Yeah, that's very different. No, it can be, of course it can, but it can also be when you say, I heard it from him.
Yes.
That can also be, it could be your memory, you have a memory loss or something.
Yes. Well, it could be. Again, this is more of a debate today, but I believe he was right, because the maxim in Muslim jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence is al-ilmu fi sudur laysa fi sutur. That knowledge is in the hearts of men, not in the books. Yeah? Knowledge, true knowledge, is taken from living beings, people who actually have connections back, teachers upon teachers upon teachers, and in his day, nobody will ask you, did you get a BA or an MSc they would ask you, who did you learn from? who was the teacher you took knowledge from.
Yeah.
And so he says book learning, and the books really, if you look at many of the books, they are based on one topic, one book that was written 1,000 years ago. Commentaries again on the same book. So he's arguing that there's little actual thinking happening. It's just commentaries, compilations of the same thing. Whereas if you take away the books and you focus on the learning, you can get a lot more out of it.
It's interesting because I see and I understand that perspective. I see.
Well, it's the way forward.
You still write,
it's the way forward.
You still make notes, don't you? Don't you?
Well, no,
make notes when we have to.
I don't deny the benefit of having written text. From what I've understood of his concern, that should be an aid to learning, not learning
Not
itself.
the only
yes, it should be an aid, something that assists the student and the teacher to almost navigate whatever topic they're talking about. It's a reference point, not it. For example, many people today only learn through books. I read a book, I open it, I read it, I've learned the topic. Well, it's very different.
It's not necessarily that it's not, I wouldn't say that's easy, but it's not necessarily that simple. You just read a book and that's it. Now with a human being involved, because I'm sure when you've read the book you have a lot of questions.
Absolutely.
There are many things that need to be clarified. Maybe you even misunderstood a few things here and there that the teacher will, from their perspective, be able to answer or correct your misunderstanding, etc.
Contextualize.
And then there's the other one with regards to the heart. The teacher also has their heart in them. I can see why he says the salaried, because if the teacher is salaried, they will not necessarily have their heart in there.
Yes.
And not necessarily correct you here or there. Not necessarily try and instill an understanding, because they can teach you, but they can also give you an understanding. It's like two.
Well,
two
what
things.
is? I am very intentional in what I'm saying here. I'm very passionate because education. What is education? What is education?
That
Right.
has to be defined. Yes.
The systematic education, the industrialized education we have today, is not what it meant in the days of the classical age.
100%.
Yeah? Education was to liberate the man, educare, to come out of something, to liberate yourself. Today, education is a formatted typeset to create workers in an industrial setting. So the education we have today, which is text-based, heavy text-based, I don't think is the same as what people are trying to go back to, which is a more human way of learning. You know?
Right.
Interacting with human beings. Each person has a different aptitude for learning. So for example, in the Ottoman maktabs, they used to have almost a statement. In this place, we do not teach birds to swim or fish to fly. Each person has a different way of learning. Yeah? When you're only based on text and the way that we have the system today right now, I believe it's indoctrination rather than education. Yeah.
Well, it's what I've said so many times also in previous episodes, right? We're educating specialist idiots nowadays. You know, they become. I mean, when you go to university, you become an architect, and that's about it. You become a doctor, and that's about it.
A cog in a machine.
That's it. So absolutely, I agree 100% that we have the polymath element totally gone, which was part of the Islamic education system at that time. And in the Muslim world, even more so, I would say, in the Muslim world, where they become engineers for the sake of finding a good job and getting good money. This is all that they're interested in. It's really not at all the original idea of education. Absolutely.
Education, I believe, has been, and this is one of the reasons why, when the printing press came to the Muslim world, there was reluctance from the scholars. It's not necessarily the Muslims or the Ottomans who were so backwards. That's not the actual narrative. They were fearful of autodidacts.
Well,
people taking the text
okay, you're
for themselves.
Looking at it you're looking at it from the intellectual perspective.
Intellectual perspective.
Now, the real truth actually was a very pragmatic one. They did have calligraphy had become the most important, a very important industry in the Ottoman Empire during that time, and they would have lost their jobs. Very simple, very pragmatically thinking, and the whole institution of calligraphy would have been lost.
It was a massive thing. Yeah.
It was a massive thing.
Massive.
So that's the more pragmatic reason behind it. Why they didn't want. It's not absolutely right. It's not as people believe. Look how backwards the sultans were. They didn't want the printing press. That was not the reason why they didn't want. Because they were
but the scholars, from that perspective, and people spent their lives as apprentices, just learning how to write the text. It was actually an official title. It was a life
It had to
career.
carry prestige with it as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, to write. But there was also a very great fear from traditional scholars that once the books, the sacred texts, were printed en masse, and anyone can open a book and read, this would cause a lot of problems in society, right? And we did see that, actually. There was a movement that began in the early 20th century of people who read the book and said, you know what, we have a different understanding of what Islam says. We don't need the clergy anymore. We can read out for ourselves. And this caused many different...
That's correct. Sorry, we never had clergy in Islam, right? So
no, we never had.
We
never had clergy. Okay, maybe the word isn't right, but we don't need the ulama.
Basically, scholars.
We don't need the ulama.
However, this is not bad, because if we look at medieval Europe, you know, the only ones who could read and write were the clergy.
Exactly.
And the clergy were misinterpreting and interpreting.
Absolutely.
And what was right, whatever they said was right.
Absolutely.
So, and if you say, listen, I read in the Bible, that's not what you say. It's what you're saying.
Well, you wouldn't have read it because you wouldn't be able to read.
Right. Well, in the case of Islam, it's exactly the opposite.
Yes.
So actually, you know, there has to be proof for what the imam or whoever it is says.
Yes. Well, who is the one to judge that? I mean, there was this concept of sola scriptura, that the scripture is the only thing you need. However, you couldn't access the scripture unless you were part of the clergy.
That's right.
Yeah, you're not allowed to open the book and read it.
You couldn't read and write.
You couldn't read and write, number one,
that's
yes.
the
Exactly, but they made sure that only a certain number of people, or class of people, could access. When the printing press was actually available, the Bible was printed, literacy rises because everybody can actually access the books and read.
So.
And then you have the revolutions where you have separation of state and religion.
Church,
right? However, within the Muslim world, we have relied so long on the isnad tradition, the connection between the reader and the teacher that goes back several centuries. Once the printing came along and the education system changed, so for example, I read a really beautiful quote the other day that when the books were printed, the teachers became obsolete. When the certificates came, the sincerity was removed. When the classroom was introduced, basically education was gone, because now you've institutionalized something that really, in ancient times, you had a mentor, someone who understood you on a very personal level and can dictate to you lessons, and you had an interaction with them back and forth. That was a level of understanding and education that we cannot get through printed text alone and through the institutions we have today. So from his perspective, I do understand where he's coming from, and especially there are too many books. It is true, sometimes the books can obscure the learning. And I believe it was Mark Twain who said, don't let education get in the way, don't let school get in the way of education. Right? It can be obscuring the reality. And you do find, for example, as historians or students of history, much of the real history is actually outside of the classroom. Real history is not going to be in the classroom. It's going to be outside the classroom.
Because again, just to jump on that point, with regards to institutionalizing education, you make it very easy for the institution to then be hijacked by other interests. And for example, which you see all over the world, is political interest. Because obviously, as a political institution in any country, you would want to keep your citizens content.
Programming.
And what's better to do that than since childhood?
Absolutely. It's a complete programming, you could say, system. Complete programming system. So the books and the argument that he does present, I believe, is very, is a potent one, and it is actually a valid one. You know, I would prefer a one-to-one interaction with teachers in a classroom, someone who I could see and question. Even the Muqaddima, as we have it today, translations, there are many elements that cannot be understood just by reading the English. For example, there are contextual elements that have to be incorporated, and questions that may arise that the book will not answer straight away.
The book cannot answer because
exactly.
Because the written word is very limited in answering questions.
Yes.
So basically what goes together is the idea of book and teacher.
Teacher coming first. Teacher coming first, and then book.
Yes. The teacher say, well, okay, yes, I mean.
Well, let me give you an example in ancient Greece. Socrates.
Right.
The Socratic method.
Right.
Socrates is known as one of the greatest teachers.
Right.
And he never used books to teach. Well, he compared himself to the midwife, that every person has within them the answers. The teacher becomes the midwife to help them give birth to the answers, right? So rather than instructing you, you have to believe this, it's a matter of questioning that person in a way that would get them to actually reason and eventually come to a conclusion that is sound or at least plausible, okay? So this is closer to what I would consider effective education.
The condition would there be that the students would be reasoning in a way of...
well, the teacher guides them, isn't it?
No,
because he would ask questions.
It's an ideal, yeah, but it's the ideal world type of thing, isn't it? That you would expect 30 students would be then, all 30 of them would be able to reason
No,
with
but
the
see,
teacher.
well,
the classes would not be so big then.
Yes.
Okay.
classes
It
would
would
not
be
be
the
so
mentoring system which you mentioned before, which
Well,
would be
we
the
have,
ideal way of
Dr.
it.
Stef, we have the Montessori way of learning, which is actually gaining prominence now, where you put everything in place in a certain setting and the student explores,
Themselves,
explorative learning. The teacher then becomes almost a mediator between the student learning, experiencing, interacting. If they have questions, teacher can then guide them towards certain elements. People learn with auditory, some people are better at listening, others with actually
Visual,
just watching
yes,
visual.
Right. Correct.
The system we have is very rigid. So I do believe, and it's a very, very clearly passionate topic here, because education, I believe, has been misappropriated in many ways, and we're creating clones. If today the agenda is we want to have this as the norm in society, we teach children that this is the norm of society. And that basically becomes it. There's no question, no critical faculty of why is it the norm of society. It is because it's in the curriculum, and we're going to teach you this as facts. And if it changes tomorrow, we'll do the same thing tomorrow, we'll change it, all right? Whereas education should actually, as it says in the title, in its original meaning, is to liberate you from these constraints, to make you somebody who can think critically and reason. So I am of the opinion that he was certainly on the right track.
On the right track.
Okay.
Now, for the very first time, students of Islamic history will have the rare and unique opportunity to study this monumental and classical work of genius under the tutelage and guidance of experts in the field of research and education. To find out more about the Muqaddima program or to enlist yourself onto this unique and fantastic learning journey, please visit our website at www.al-Muqaddima.com, where you will be able to download our program prospectus, register your interest by submitting an application directly via the online enrollment form.